Have you ever wondered if George Washington was always the confident, successful leader we read about in history books? The truth might surprise you. More than 20 years before he led the Continental Army to victory during the American Revolution, George Washington suffered one of the worst defeats of his military career. At just 22 years old, he found himself trapped inside a small wooden fort surrounded by hundreds of French soldiers and their Native American allies. After hours of fighting in pouring rain, Washington made a decision that seemed unthinkable. He surrendered. But this wasn't just the story of one young officer's defeat. The events that unfolded at Fort Necessity helped ignite a conflict that spread across 4 continents. Many historians consider it to be the beginning of the first true World War. Even more remarkable, the lessons Washington learned from this humiliating experience would shape the military leader he would become 2 decades later. Today, we're separating Hollywood from history and exploring what really happened at the Battle of Fort Necessity, why it mattered, and how one disastrous day in the Pennsylvania wilderness changed the course of history. When most people think about America's early history, they picture 13 peaceful British colonies stretching along the Atlantic coast. But just beyond those settlements lay a vast wilderness that both Britain and France desperately wanted to control. That region was known as the Ohio Country. It wasn't simply land just waiting to be claimed. It was home to many Native American nations, including the Shawnee, Delaware, Mingo, and others. Each had their own governments, cultures, and alliances. These nations had lived there for generations and suddenly found themselves caught between 2 powerful European empires competing for influence. The Ohio Country was valuable for several reasons. Its rivers formed natural highways into the interior of North America. The region supported a thriving fur trade that generated enormous wealth. Whoever controlled its territory could shape the future of the continent. By 1754, tensions between Britain and France had reached a breaking point. Virginia's governor wanted to stop the French from building forts in the Ohio Valley, so he turned to a young militia officer named George Washington. Washington was only 22 years old. He had courage, ambition, and a strong desire to prove himself, but he had very little experience leading soldiers in combat. His mission sounded simple: move into the Ohio Country and protect Britain's claim before the French could strengthen theirs. Instead, everything went wrong. As Washington marched north with his men, he received intelligence that a small French party was nearby. Believing that they were scouting his position, Washington decided to strike first. In a brief engagement now known as the Battle of Jumonville Glen, his forces surprised the French camp and opened fire. The fighting lasted only a short time, but its consequences would echo around the world. The French commander Joseph Coulon de Jumonville was killed during or immediately after this battle. Exactly what happened remains one of history's most debated questions. The French insisted Jumonville had been on a diplomatic mission and had accused Washington of attacking an envoy who was carrying official communications. British leaders argued that he was a military officer gathering intelligence and preparing for conflict. We'll probably never know the complete truth. What we do know is that the French viewed Jumonville's death as an act that demanded revenge. Washington had won a small skirmish. But in doing so, he had placed himself directly in the path of a much larger French force that was already preparing to respond. And that response would lead him to build a tiny little fort with a name that history would never forget: Fort Necessity. After the clash at Jumonville Glen, George Washington knew the French would be coming. The only question was how soon, and with how many soldiers. Rather than continue deeper into the Ohio Country, Washington decided to pull back and prepare for a defensive fight. His men stopped at a clearing known as the Great Meadows, a wide grassy opening surrounded by dense forest in what is now known as southwestern Pennsylvania. At first glance, it seemed like a reasonable choice. The open meadow provided great visibility. There was a nearby water source. Wagons and supplies could move through the clearing more easily than through the thick woods. Washington believed that the open ground would prevent the French from sneaking up on his position. But there was one major problem. The meadow sat in a shallow basin with tree-covered hills rising all around it. Today, military historians often point to this as Washington's biggest tactical mistake. Any enemy occupying the surrounding tree line would have the high ground and natural cover, allowing them to fire down into the fort while remaining difficult to see. Instead of forcing attackers into the open, Washington had placed his own soldiers in the most exposed position. Still, there wasn't much time. Washington's men immediately began building a small wooden fort. Despite its impressive name, Fort Necessity, it was hardly a fortress. It was little more than a circular stockade, roughly 50 feet across, surrounded by a shallow trench and earthen embankments. Inside, there was barely enough room for the soldiers, their supplies, and a few small structures. It was built quickly because it had to be. Washington expected reinforcements from Virginia, and he had hoped that the fort would hold on long enough for additional troops to arrive. But as the days passed, help came slowly, while reports of growing French forces became more frequent. Adding to the tension, conditions in the wilderness were miserable. The soldiers worked in the cold rain and the deep mud. Their uniforms remained damp. Food was limited. Mosquitoes and insects were relentless. Roads turned into muddy ruts, making it difficult to move supplies or heavy equipment. Every day that passed made Washington's position weaker instead of stronger. Meanwhile, the French were doing exactly what Washington had feared. A force led by Louis Coulon Duvier, the older brother of Jumonville, was marching toward Fort Necessity. For the Duviers, this simply wasn't another military campaign. It was personal. His brother had been killed only weeks earlier, and he intended to force the young Virginian responsible to answer for it. As French troops advanced with their Native American allies, Washington realized the small skirmish on Jumonville Glen had grown into something far more dangerous. His little fort, hastily built in the middle of a meadow, was about to face hundreds of experienced soldiers. And with every passing hour, the odds against him grew worse. The battle that would define George Washington's early career was only moments away. On the morning of July 3, 1754, the attack finally came. Emerging from the surrounding forest were approximately 600 French soldiers and Canadian militia, accompanied by about 100 Native American warriors allied with France. They were led by Duvier, the brother of the French officer killed on Jumonville Glen. Inside Fort Necessity, George Washington commanded roughly 400 men. Many were Virginia militiamen with little to no combat experience. They were brave, but they were facing seasoned soldiers who understood exactly how to fight in the wilderness. Rather than charge the fort, the French used the terrain to their advantage. They spread out through the trees that surrounded the meadow, taking cover behind rocks, logs, and thick vegetation. From there, they poured musket fire into the fort while remaining difficult to see. Washington's men had almost nowhere to hide. To return fire, they had to expose themselves, firing toward flashes of smoke and movement in the woods. Every advantage belonged to the attackers. Then the weather made a bad situation even worse. A steady rain began to fall. Before long, the battlefield became a sea of mud. The shallow trenches around Fort Necessity quickly filled with water. Soldiers stood ankle-deep in mud as rain soaked through their clothing, ammunition, and equipment. In the days before waterproof cartridges, black powder had one major weakness. It didn't work well when it got wet. Muskets misfired. Gunpowder became unreliable. Reloading grew slower and more difficult with every passing minute. Inside the fort, conditions became chaotic. The cramped space offered little protection, and every volley from surrounding woods reminded Washington that his position was becoming impossible to defend. Hour after hour, the fighting continued. As darkness approached, Washington faced a difficult reality. His men were exhausted. Supplies were running low. The fort was vulnerable, and there was little hope that reinforcements would arrive in time. That evening, the French offered terms of surrender. Washington gathered his officers to consider the offer. Continuing the fight would almost certainly mean more unnecessary deaths, so he made a painful decision to accept. The fighting stopped, but one final mistake would make the defeat even more damaging. The surrender document was written in French, a language that Washington could not read. He relied on the interpreter to explain its contents before signing. Later, Washington learned that the document described the death of Jumonville as an assassination. That single word carried enormous political consequences. The French quickly circulated the document throughout Europe, claiming that Washington himself had admitted responsibility for murdering a French officer who had been serving as an official envoy. Washington insisted that he never intended to confess to an assassination and maintained that he had not fully understood the wording of the document. Historians still debate whether the translation was inaccurate, misunderstood, or whether the French intentionally used language that favored their version of events. Whatever the truth, the damage was done. At just 22 years old, George Washington had suffered his first military defeat, surrendered his fort, and unknowingly signed a document that became a powerful piece of French propaganda. Many people believed his military career was already over. Instead, this humiliating defeat would become the turning point that shaped the commander he would one day become. If George Washington had never fought at Fort Necessity, history might remember him very differently. To many people at the time, his career appeared to be over before it had really begun. Newspapers criticized the defeat. Military leaders questioned his judgment. He had surrendered his fort, lost the campaign, and signed a document that embarrassed both himself and the British. But Washington did something that would define the rest of his life. He learned from his mistakes. Just 1 year later, he returned to the Ohio frontier as a volunteer aide to the British General Braddock. Washington witnessed firsthand what happened when experienced European officers underestimated the North American forests, rugged terrain, and unconventional style of warfare. During the disastrous Battle of the Monongahela in 1755, Braddock was mortally wounded, and much of the British force collapsed in panic. Washington's calm leadership during the retreat earned him widespread respect. It also reinforced lessons he had first begun learning at Fort Necessity. He learned that the terrain could determine the outcome of the battle before the first shot was fired. He learned that the supply lines and logistics often mattered as much as the courage. He learned that listening to experienced scouts and native allies could be the difference between success and disaster. And perhaps more importantly, he learned that pride and overconfidence could cost lives. Those lessons stayed with him. More than 20 years later, Washington commanded the Continental Army during the American Revolution. He often avoided the kind of reckless, decisive battles that had nearly destroyed him as a young officer. Instead, he preserved his army whenever possible, chose his ground carefully, and understood that surviving to fight another day could be more important than winning a single battle. The defeat at Fort Necessity also had consequences far beyond George Washington. What began as a struggle over the Ohio Valley soon exploded into the French and Indian War in North America. But the fighting didn't stay there. Britain and France carried the conflict across Europe, the Caribbean, West Africa, India, and even the Philippines. Historians now recognize this larger conflict as the 7 Years' War, which many describe as the world's first truly global war. Ironically, Britain's victory came at an enormous financial cost. To help pay for the war, Parliament began taxing its American colonies with measures like the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act. Those taxes sparked protests, boycotts, and growing resentment toward British rule. In other words, the road to the American Revolution didn't begin in 1775. It began more than 20 years earlier in a muddy Pennsylvania meadow where a young George Washington surrendered a tiny fort called Fort Necessity. History often celebrates great victories, but sometimes failure becomes the greatest teacher of all. Without the lessons Washington learned in defeat, it's possible he would have never become the commander who led the colonies to independence, or the leader who became the first president of the United States. Fort Necessity wasn't the end of George Washington's story. It was the chapter that made the rest of it possible. Now let's compare what really happened with what we see in young Washington. Overall, the filmmakers deserve credit for introducing viewers to a part of George Washington's life that many Americans had never even heard about. Instead of focusing only on the Revolutionary War, they chose to tell the story of a young, ambitious officer who was still learning what it meant to lead. That alone makes the film worth watching. The movie captures several important historical facts correctly. Washington really was only 22 years old. The conflict did begin over the Ohio Valley. The Battle of Jumonville Glen set the stage for the French attack, and Fort Necessity really was a hastily constructed fort in an exposed meadow. Washington also did surrender after a day of fighting in miserable weather. Those are the broad strokes of history, and the film gets them right. But as with most historical dramas, the details are often simplified. The movie compresses timelines and combines events to keep the story moving. Some conversations are fictional because no one knows what was actually said. Certain officers receive more attention while others disappear entirely. The relationships between British officers, colonial militia, French forces, and Native American allies are also simplified so audience can more easily follow the story. Perhaps the biggest difference is how the movie portrays Washington himself. Hollywood naturally wants a hero. The real Washington was far more complicated. He was intelligent and determined, but he also was inexperienced. He made questionable tactical decisions, underestimated his enemy, and chose to build a fort in a location that military historians still criticize today. Those mistakes don't make him less impressive. In many ways, they make him more human. One of the reasons Washington became an effective leader later in life is because he experienced failure early in his career. Instead of allowing that defeat to define him, he studied it, adapted, and became a better commander because of it. That's a lesson that rarely makes it into movies. If we were scoring young Washington strictly on historical accuracy, we'd give it an 8.5 out of 10. It tells the story right, captures the major events, and portrays Washington's character well. Most of its departures from history are the kinds of changes filmmakers often make to improve pacing and storytelling rather than completely rewriting the past. For a historical drama, that's an impressive achievement. George Washington's surrender at Fort Necessity could have ended his military career before it ever truly began. Instead, it became the foundation for everything that followed. His defeat taught him lessons about leadership, humility, preparation, and perseverance. Lessons that would eventually help him command the Continental Army through 8 difficult years of war and become the first president of the United States. History reminds us that greatness isn't built on success alone. Sometimes it's built on failure and on what we choose to do afterward. If you enjoyed separating Hollywood from history, let me know in the comments. Did young Washington strike the right balance between historical accuracy and entertainment, or would you have told the story completely differently? If you enjoyed this episode, please like the video, subscribe to New Season Academy, and share it with someone who loves history as much as we do. Until next time, stay curious, because history always has another story to tell.